Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for coming. This is my first time at PALS, and I spent this afternoon just sort of walking around in utter and total amazement. And really, my conclusion after seeing this place is it's really just an honor to be here. And I think it's so inspiring for independent booksellers everywhere, and a realization that this can work. So thanks for having me. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my experience with Crescent Security Group, but I also wanted to spend more time than I usually do talking about Blackwater, given the events of the last few days. But I wanted to just sort of start by telling you how I got into this world. I first started going to Iraq in the fall of 2004 as a reporter for the Washington Post. My initial assignment was basically to cover the U.S. military experience in Iraq and sort of what the ground war looked like and who was fighting it. So I spent the fall of 2004 doing that, and then all of 2005. And when I got to the end of 2005, I found that I really wasn't done with Iraq for reasons that I had difficulty explaining to my family and trying to define. But also my newspaper, of course, felt that it was an incredibly important story. And there was this sense, I think, at the time that a sort of fatigue was setting in, at the end of 2005, that people were already sort of becoming tired of the drumbeat of stories about violence and mayhem. And so we tried to look at different ways to cover the war. And one of my editors approached me and said, well, why don't we look into the private side of the war? That issue encompasses some 190,000 people who work as contractors in Iraq. 190,000. That's some 30,000 more than the maximum number of U.S. troops that have fought in Iraq at any given time. I immediately became focused on a subset of those people, which were the sort of hired guns that were operating in support of the U.S.-led coalition. When I was covering the military, I would see them everywhere. You'd see them in the chow halls on the U.S. military bases, or you would see them on the roads. They looked like they had sort of driven out of a Mad Max movie. They were obviously civilians. They wore civilian clothes, but they were heavily armed, and they drove around in these crazy multicolored vehicles, many of which were significantly armored, were modified pickup trucks, or sort of all manner of vehicles. And I never really understood kind of what they did or who they were, or how many of them there were, or how much combat they were seeing, if any. And so the initial goal was just to sort of find out what this world was all about. So I made a contact who hooked me up with this company called Crescent Security Group. Like everyone at the time, I knew basically a few companies. Blackwater, of course, the main one, and a few others. A few other large companies, DynCorp and Triple Canopy, so this guy hooked me up with this company called Crescent, which I really knew very little about. They were based in Kuwait City, so I made a contact with a guy who identified himself as the director of security for the company, and I flew to Kuwait City from California, where I live, and I got off the plane, and they were living. This company was living out of a house in the Kuwait City suburbs. I say in the book, it was the strangest sensation. It was like basing a paramilitary group like in the middle of the Portland suburbs, or San Fernando Valley or something like that. And they kept their vehicles out back. And the next morning, I got up with the same guy who picked me up at the airport, and we piled into this truck and we started making our way up to the border. We were totally alone. Like, none of the other guys were with us. They all went up to the border on their own. It was about an hour's drive from Kuwait City up to the Iraq border, and I quickly realized that these guys commuted to the war. You know, they got in their trucks every morning and they drove up to Iraq to do their jobs. So we're moving toward the border, and we get up there, and there's a big, huge U.S. military base right on the Kuwait-Iraq border called Camp Navistar. And now the sun is up, and we pull into this big sort of vacant lot, like a big sort of a lot about the size of 2 football fields. And many of the other contractors are milling around, and there's all these semi trucks that they're going to be escorting into Iraq. They're sort of idling in a line, and next to them. And then they're just standing there, and they're chatting and smoking, and they're wearing khaki pants and sort of polo shirts. And I get out of the truck and I start looking around, and immediately I start to feel like something's kind of amiss. Because I take a look at the trucks, and this was a time when it's really hard to overstate the violence that was going on in Iraq at this time. It was an extremely dangerous place, and nobody that I knew, including the Washington Post, was traveling around Iraq in anything but heavily armored vehicles. The Post, we had these armored Jeep Cherokees that we drove around in, and everybody drove in armored vehicles. But these guys were getting ready to drive into Iraq in pickup trucks. Like the kind of pickup trucks you would see like driving around Portland, and I thought that was kind of weird. And then I noticed that nobody had any guns, and I was thinking, well, that's kind of weird. And so I asked one of the guys, so where are the guns? And he said, oh yeah, well we can't bring our weapons into Kuwait, so we keep them in a shipping container on the other side of the border. And we pick them up when we get across the border. And I said, well, is that safe? And he said, well, it's funny you should mention that, because just a couple months ago, we got across the border, we cracked open the shipping container, and all the weapons were gone. And I said, well, what happened? Because obviously you can't work in Iraq, as a private security company, pretty much fundamentally, unless you're armed. And he said, oh, well, the owner of the company sent out $50,000 on the black market with one of the Iraqi employees into Iraq, and they bought a whole bunch of new weapons. So the guy apparently came back with dozens of AK-47s and ammunition and law rockets and all kinds of other stuff. And when they got the weapons back, they checked them, and the serial numbers were identical to the ones that had been ripped off. They literally bought back their own weapons. So I'm kind of, sort of standing here, with kind of a, sort of a feeling, that something is really, really not right. And then I start to talk to some of the guys who work for the company. And one of the first guys I met was this incredibly friendly guy, this really big, bulky guy who started to tell me that he had worked as a police officer in suburban Minneapolis for several years, and then he had applied for his job in Iraq over the internet, and had gotten a job working as a private security contractor, which seemed weird enough to me. And he was wearing this, he was wearing a baseball cap with that said EMT on the front, like big block letters. And he explained to me that he was the company medic. And I said, oh wow, well, where did you get your where did you get your license to be a medic? And he said, oh well, I'm not really a medic, but I read a lot of books, and and so they gave me the job, and he said, it's really difficult to be the medic for Crescent Security Group, because we don't have a lot of stuff. And I said, well, what are you missing? And he said, well, like tourniquets. We don't have that. And then he proceeds to tell me this harrowing story where they had been hit by these. In that year, there had been the advent of these extremely powerful bombs in Iraq called EFPs, explosively formed projectiles, as the military called them. And the military's theory was that they'd come in from Iran. They were shaped charges that were multiple times more powerful than the previous bombs that had been used. And one of these flimsy pickup trucks had been hit by one of these bombs, and blew the vehicle like 150 yards off the highway, killing 2 of their Iraqi employees. And this guy who was the medic, his name was Paul Rubin, he had rushed over to try to treat the Iraqis, and he didn't have any tourniquets, and so he was ripping off pieces of one of the guy's vests to form the tourniquets, but it was difficult for him to do it. So at this point, I'm just sort of feeling like, this is not a good idea. And at the same time, I'm sort of mesmerized because I really had no idea of this world, even though I'd spent so much time in Iraq. And then I started talking to some of the other guys who work for the company, and it actually started to set my mind at ease because it was a really wide variety of, it was a wide range of people. There was a former Marine from Redding, California, whose name was Josh Munns, and he had been in the Battle of Fallujah in 2004, and when he got out of the military, he immediately regretted it, and he came home and he got a job installing swimming pools in Redding. He was this incredibly competent guy, really straight up, very incredible, really serious, and he projected this sort of air of real competence. And he told me that he was building these swimming pools, and he was just bored out of his mind. He had been in the most violent confrontation in Iraq, the Battle of Fallujah in 2004, and he just could not deal with it. He could not deal with the boredom. So he immediately tried to re-enlist in the Marines, and they told him that to get the occupational specialty that he wanted, he needed to wait for the fiscal year to turn over. And so he couldn't wait. He just had to get back, and so he joined this company, which he had heard could pay him $7,000 a month, protecting these supply convoys that went out in and out of Iraq. So I hung out with these guys, sort of against my better judgment, really, for the better part of a couple weeks, and just sort of driving in and out. And they protected these supply convoys, and then they would go back to Kuwait, and it was surreal, because they would go into Iraq, and then they would come out, they'd go to Kuwait City, and then they'd go out to dinner, like go to Chili's or TGI Fridays, or it was the weirdest thing. And so then I came home, and I was getting ready to write my story about all these guys, and before I could even write a word, I got a call from my editor telling me that Josh Munns and Paul Rubin, the medic, and 3 other guys who I had been with had all been kidnapped on the exact same highway that we had been driving up and down on. Nothing was heard about them for quite some time, about a year, and then in March of earlier this year, a government informant walked up to the air base in Basra in southern Iraq, carrying a plastic bag with the severed fingers of all 5 of these guys. And then it was basically an indication of the U.S. government that he knew where the bodies were. And then he came back a month later, and they dropped off the bodies themselves at the air base. When I got with Crescent Security Group, that trip, it really opened my eyes to a whole bunch of things about the war in Iraq. What I found out was that the private security world was not just Blackwater or Triple Canopy or DynCorp, that in fact there was effectively a parallel war that was going on in Iraq that involved tens of thousands of hired guns who had been brought in to support the United States military, operating for hundreds of different companies that basically mushroomed overnight in response to the fundamental fact that there were never enough troops in Iraq. The companies were so varied, it was just mind-blowing. You had of course American companies, but you had British companies, you had Australian companies, you had people from South Africa, you had Fijians, you had Peruvians, you had Colombians, you had Mexicans, and people just pouring in from all over the world to do this work. The pay range was, like any industry, it was a business, and so like any industry, you had companies like Crescent that were paying their guys like $7,000 a month, and then you had companies like Blackwater and DynCorp that were paying their guys, $15,000, $20,000 a month. And the thing that was most striking was that there were absolutely no rules that applied to their actions on the battlefield. None. The military, of course, it operates under this extremely rigid code called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and everybody who's in the military knows exactly what those rules are. But with the private security contractors, it was never entirely clear what law, if any, applied to their actions. The U.S. occupation government in 2004 had basically granted an edict that exempted all contractors working in Iraq. It exempted them from the Iraqi legal process, and yet it was never clear if there was any international or U.S. law that applied to their actions. And this was driven home to me when I covered a story involving one of these contractors who worked for Triple Canopy. And what I'd heard was that he had announced to his colleagues one day that he really wanted to kill somebody that day. And his colleagues, they didn't really take it seriously. He was sort of prone to giving kind of such sort of outlandish statements. But when they got out on the airport road in Baghdad that day, according to the other three people in the vehicle, he pushed open his door and fired several rounds from his weapon into the windshield of a passing taxi. And when that happened, there was never any. It was even the guy who had been accused of this crime acknowledged that he had been accused of attempted murder, essentially. But there was no legal authority or no legal process to deal with what had happened. And when I asked the contractors, what rules apply to you? What is your understanding of what the rules are? And one of the guys said to me, well, the company told us that if the Iraqis ever try to arrest us, that they'll throw us in the back of a car and drive us out of the country in the middle of the night. And they told me that they had this expression that they called big boy rules, and they said that was effectively their own system for policing themselves under their own code of justice. To me, the embodiment of this code, this big boy rules, was in fact Blackwater. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Blackwater and the system that company operated under. As a lot of people here probably know, in the last few days, 5 Blackwater contractors were indicted by a grand jury in Washington for their involvement in a shooting incident in which somewhere between 14 and 17 Iraqis were killed in September 2007. This event, this attempted prosecution by the U.S. Justice Department is significant in a lot of different ways, but the main reason is that it's the first time that any real authority has attempted to prosecute a private security contractor for any crime in Iraq, and we're now approaching the 6th year of the war. We're in the 6th year of the war. We've almost gone 6 full years of war at this point. I wanted to talk a little bit about Blackwater and what preceded that incident, because it's one incident of several incidents that occurred involving Blackwater. And my feeling, and I think it's laid out fairly specifically in the book, is that much of what went on with Blackwater was related to its employer, the U.S. State Department. One of the common misconceptions about the private security world in Iraq is that these companies operated under a whole variety of different contracts, thousands and thousands upon private security contracts, and the contract was the ultimate authority over these companies. Blackwater's contract was with the State Department. That contract has paid Blackwater at this point, $1.5 billion for their operations in Iraq. Their primary responsibility, of course, is to protect the U.S. ambassador and diplomats operating under the State Department as they move around Baghdad. And as soon as I started to cover the private security world, I began to hear about Blackwater and the kind of activities that they were involved in. there had been a series of questionable shooting incidents that had raised the attention of not only the Iraqi population, but also the Iraqi government, which felt completely powerless to do anything about the company. And this drumbeat of incidents continued all through 2005, through 2006, and then into 2007, leading up to this Nisur Square incident that is now the focus of these indictments. One of the most egregious incidents happened on Christmas Eve in 2006, when a Blackwater contractor got drunk at a Christmas Eve party inside Baghdad's Green Zone. He walked out of this party and he apparently stumbled into a bodyguard who worked for an Iraqi vice president. When that confrontation occurred, this Blackwater employee allegedly shot and killed this bodyguard for this Iraqi vice president, and then fled the scene. Ended up in his trailer where he was so drunk the security forces inside the Green Zone had to wait to interview him. So I don't normally read, but I wanted to read this one part from the book because I think it will give you a real flavor for sort of how the State Department was treating Blackwater. So that's the setup, and this is what occurred after this gentleman was found in his trailer. Later, on Christmas Day, U.S. Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad received a furious call from Mahdi, the Iraqi vice president. He told Khalilzad that a drunk American wandering in the Green Zone had killed one of his guards. Khalilzad rushed to Mahdi's home, where Khalif's grieving family had gathered. Mahdi demanded that Khalilzad hand over the suspect to Iraqi authorities. Instead, the next morning, Blackwater and the U.S. Embassy shipped Moonen out of Iraq. His travel arrangements were authorized by the State Department's senior regional security officer, Blackwater's U.S. government supervisor in Iraq. A Blackwater convoy ferried Moonen to Baghdad International Airport, where the security company was able to blow through checkpoints because of its U.S. government affiliation. Moonen flew on to Amman and then apparently home. Once he was gone, State Department officials scrambled to contain the shooting. A criminal investigation did not appear to be on the table. U.S. officials tried to calibrate apologies and payoffs. Quote, "Will you be following up on Blackwater to do all possible to assure that a sizable compensation is forthcoming?" One embassy official wrote Randall Bennett, the senior regional security officer, in an email. "If we are to avoid this whole thing becoming even worse, I think a prompt pledge and an apology, even if they want to claim it was accidental, would be the best way to assure that the Iraqis don't take steps, such as telling Blackwater that they are no longer able to work in Iraq." The official first proposed a $250,000 payment to the victim's family, then $100,000. A diplomatic security official objected to such crazy sums. The official was concerned it might encourage Iraqis to commit suicide by Blackwater. "This could result in incidents with people trying to get killed by our guys to financially guarantee their family's future," the official wrote. The State Department eventually settled on the low end of the scale. Blackwater paid the dead guard's family $15,000. Moonen, it turned out, was fined almost exactly the same amount by the company, $14,697. The fine came in the form of forfeited compensation. If the whole thing hadn't been so tragic, the breakdown of what Moonen lost could have been drawn up for a Saturday Night Live sketch. Return airfare, $1,630. Completion bonus, $7,067. 4th of July bonus, $3,000. Christmas bonus, $3,000. Moonen had lost his Christmas bonus for allegedly shooting someone on Christmas Eve. That incident happened on Christmas Eve, and of course, and then 6 weeks later, Blackwater was protecting another official at the Iraqi Justice Ministry. The Blackwater set up on the roof of the Justice Ministry, and across the street from the ministry was a media compound called Iraqia. It's like CNN. It's like the CNN of Baghdad. It was set up by the United States after the fall of Saddam Hussein, essentially as sort of a response to Saddam's propaganda network. So Blackwater is set up on the roof of the Justice Ministry, and they're looking down into this other compound across the street. And there's security guards that are working for Al-Qaeda across the street. For reasons that continue to be unexplained, these Blackwater snipers ended up shooting and killing 3 guards who were working for this media network. They fled immediately, dropping smoke grenades to cover their tracks. And when the State Department went to ask them what had happened, they told the State Department that they had been fired upon from this media network and responded with targeted rounds. The State Department never interviewed anybody at the media network, never really even returned to the scene of the crime. They basically closed the case after those interviews. And then in May, about 2 months after that, a Blackwater team was driving outside the Iraqi Interior Ministry and ended up shooting a civilian driver who was leaving a gas station right in front. When that happened, the Blackwater team began to leave and was headed back toward the green zone. And when that happened, the Iraqi Interior Ministry sent out its own security team to confront this Blackwater team. And what happened was, it essentially led to an armed showdown in the middle of Baghdad between the Iraqi security forces and the Blackwater guards. The only thing that prevented just a total conflagration was a passing U.S. military convoy that arrived on the scene. The U.S. commander leaped out his vehicle and literally got in between the two opposing sides. The Blackwater team returned to the State Department, it returned to the green zone, and the Iraqi team returned to the Interior Ministry. I only found out about the incident because I was in California at the time, and I got an email from a friend of mine, an American who worked at the Interior Ministry as an advisor, telling me that the U.S. military had to evacuate him from the building because the Americans were so concerned that there would be retribution by the Iraqis because of this Blackwater incident. So when I called up the State Department to find out what happened, they told me, that yes, first they denied it, and then they told me that yes, there was an incident. That Blackwater had come under fire and had returned targeted rounds, that the shooting was justifiable. So I asked the State Department, well, how was it that you were able to determine that the shooting was justifiable? It happened just 24 hours ago. And he told me, well, we conducted our investigation, and that's how we determined it. And I said, well, what did you do? What did the investigation entail? And he said, well, I'm not really going to get into the details. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because I don't feel like it. That was pretty much the State Department's attitude toward Blackwater all through 2007. And then, of course, the result was ultimately that in September of 2007, we had this incident where an Iraqi medical student was driving his mother on errands and entered a traffic circle known as Nisur Square. When he got to this traffic circle, a Blackwater team was coming in the opposite direction. The Blackwater team seems to have perceived some kind of a threat and then opened fire, killing the medical student instantly. What seems to have happened is that his foot remained on the accelerator and the car kept hurtling forward and was driving straight toward the Blackwater team. And the Blackwater team continued to fire into the vehicle, killing the medical student's mother and then blowing up the vehicle with a rocket-propelled grenade. When that happened, it triggered a barrage of automatic weapons fire in the square, and ultimately 14 to 17 Iraqis were killed. I just wanted to talk about that because I think it's important to know the context in which Blackwater was operating. Blackwater was ruthlessly efficient in the way they protected State Department employees. My theory is that they did exactly what they were instructed to do, and and it led to basically a disaster. Obviously for Iraqis, for the people who were involved, it was a disaster for the U.S. mission in Iraq, and it's something that really the mission is still dealing with.
You've been listening to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Steve Fainaru talking about his latest book, Big Boy Rules: America's Mercenaries Fighting in Iraq. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment from the presentation. Steve Fainaru is a correspondent with the Washington Post. He received the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on security contractors working in Iraq. In addition to his latest book, Big Boy Rules: America's Mercenaries Fighting in Iraq, Steve Fainaru is also author of The Duke of Havana, Baseball, Cuba, and the Search for the American Dream, co-authored with Ray Sanchez. And now we return to the question and answer segment from the program. Steve Fainaru spoke at Powell's City of Books in Portland, Oregon on December 8, 2008. The first member of the audience with a question asked who is protecting Blackwater, who at the State Department is protecting these mercenary companies from accountability. Well,
the regional security officer is in charge of is in charge of Blackwater. Who's protecting them? The reality is, one of the things that happened with Nisour Square is it pointed up a fundamental reality about Blackwater and the State Department. The Iraqi government's immediate response to the Nisour Square shootings was to announce that Blackwater had been banned from Iraq and that they were going to prosecute these people in Iraq. Well, what happened was that Blackwater repainted its trucks, and 3 days later they drove outside the green zone, business as usual. And the reason for that wasn't because they had a sugar daddy or anything like that. The reason was because the State Department would have collapsed without Blackwater. The State Department in Iraq simply would not have been able to function without Blackwater. They were so dependent on the company that it was impossible for the State Department to live without Blackwater.
The next member of the audience referred back to the Vietnam War, saying that there were many abuses of the civilian population, abuses that appear to be happening in Iraq, abuses at the hands of these mercenary companies. During the Vietnam War, some American soldiers looked down on the Vietnamese. There was a lot of racism. The Vietnamese people were viewed by some American soldiers as subhuman. Do you see any of that happening in Iraq today?
Yeah, I think after the invasion, the Iraq that I saw in 2004 was, it was a country in name only, really. It was a country that was completely defined by the violence that pervaded it, and everybody's life was defined by that, whether it was the military or people who were working in this sort of private security mercenary industry. And I think that inevitably people became dehumanized in the eyes of the many people who were fighting it. First of all, it was an incredibly dangerous environment, so for everybody, for Iraqis and Americans, and so I think it magnified a lot of perceptions that people had about the exactly, because I think I really do think it's important to say that a lot of the people who took these jobs, the great majority of the people who took these jobs, they had been in the military, they had acquired very specific skills in the military, and then they came back to Iraq doing jobs that were officially sanctioned by the United States government. And most of them were professional and acted according to their conscience, even if there were no rules applying to their actions. But I do think that in the military and in the private security world, that people began to look at Iraqis as sort of one monolithic entity.
The next member of the audience observed that these attitudes towards the Iraqi people are not just found among American soldiers or mercenaries, but that the Americans here at home have also become callous towards the suffering of the Iraqis. Language that describes civilian injuries and death as collateral damage, and statements by U.S. government officials that tell us that these Iraqi casualties are unfortunate but are just a part of the war. All this conveys the meaning that these people, the Iraqi people, are just not important, even though we are told that our occupation, the U.S. occupation of Iraq and the war, were intended to help the Iraqi people. This member of the audience believes that the American news media have had a role in this process of minimizing the importance, the moral significance, of the Iraqi civilian casualties. The numbers are sometimes reported, the numbers of deaths and injuries, but there seem to be very few news stories about individual Iraqis, nor are they reporting on the mercenaries, the growth of these companies, and their increasingly important role in the occupation, nor about the costs of these private contractors and how that fits into the budget for the war.
With regard to the media, I mean, I guess I would sort of respectfully disagree. I think the run-up to the war, the failure of the media to challenge the Bush administration on the basic assumptions about why we went to war is one of the biggest failures in the history of American journalism. But what I would say is that I think that during the prosecution of the war, I really do believe that the media has been much more aggressive and in terms of covering the war. I mean, you talked about the fate of Iraqis. One of my colleagues, Anthony Shadid, who wrote a brilliant book called Night Draws Near, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for his coverage of exactly the issues you're talking about. I mean, for better, I won the Pulitzer Prize for my paper's coverage of mercenaries in Iraq. What I would say is I agree with you about the euphemisms that are used and how dangerous they are. I never use the word mercenaries in my stories for the Post, and I use it liberally in the book, and there's a reason for that. The Post at some point made a determination that the word mercenary was too politically charged to use. But to me, the term private security contractor doesn't begin to describe the magnitude of what is going on with these people. I mean, they are out there representing us. They are killing and they're being killed. They're getting involved in what can only be described as combat. And yet, and this is a point that I make throughout the book, this is a whole hidden part of the war that obscured the true cost of the war, because none of these people were counted in troop levels, all the basic metrics that we use to measure how the war is going, troop levels, number and frequency of attacks, casualty figures. None of this is included in those figures. And I think it's purposeful. The Bush administration simply lacked the political will and the spine to deal with the magnitude of what was happening in Iraq, and they rented out, they outsourced. I mean, to me, this is the fundamental point. The most solemn responsibility probably that our government has is to decide who can represent us in wartime, killing and dying on behalf of you and me. And they're outsourcing this responsibility to companies like Crescent Security Group and Blackwater and allowing them to decide. And to me, that's the most insidious part of the whole phenomenon.
The next member of the audience observed that Hillary Clinton will effectively be the next boss of these mercenary companies. With respect to her coming in as Secretary of State and the incoming Obama administration, do you see a change in the policy, the tactics, behavior, strategy with respect to the private contractors and mercenaries?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch because, Obama, as a senator, was fairly aggressive in trying to bring about some kind of regulation for the security industry in Iraq. But when he's been asked, he's never said he'd be willing to ban them from Iraq. And there's a simple reason for that. It's like if you took those people out of the equation, the whole thing would just implode. I mean, there's just no way that they could continue to operate. And so if Obama's going to embark on the strategic campaign of withdrawing from Iraq, he's going to need these people. And I think the question is, how is it going to work? Because some people believe that the security industry needs the cover of the U.S. government to operate in Iraq, but many people, including myself, believe that they're when push comes to shove, they're in it for the money. And if there's money to be made, they're going to stay. And there's certainly the security environment is not going to. It's better now than it was a year ago, but it's still an extremely dangerous place. And so everything from the oil services industry to other infrastructure improvements, all those people are going to need private security. One of the questions I think we're going to have to see is Blackwater, because their contract will be up. And is the State Department, is Hillary and Obama, they're going to be willing to unilaterally withdraw Blackwater, which would create enormous strain on the State Department, but of course would probably be the right thing to do at this point.
The next member of the audience said that he agreed with the earlier question about media coverage, that there had been a kind of blackout on the media coverage of the Blackwater story.
Yeah, I mean, all I can tell you is, it's really interesting because in terms of like whatever blackout you're referring to, I mean, when we got into this story, when I started writing about it, my newspaper could not get enough stories. The appetite was off the charts, and every single one of them went on page one. I mean, and I think it was for exactly what you're talking about. There hadn't been that much reporting on it. I don't think it's a function of anything beyond the fact that one of the real untold stories about the media in Iraq is how few people are actually covering the war at this point. I mean, there's probably more people in this room than there are covering the war, and that has everything to do with money, and fatigue, and just resources. I mean, the Washington Post. I mean, it costs us $1 million a year to cover the war in Iraq. The Oregonian isn't going to be sending people to Iraq to cover the war, and nor is any other real regional newspaper. Papers like the Boston Globe and the Chicago Tribune and the Philadelphia Inquirer, big cities, big papers, they can't afford it. And so I really don't. I mean, I understand a lot of people's frustration with the coverage. I really do, but it's not like there's no conspiracy to not write about it. It's just I just think it's resources. When I started covering it, I was blown away. I could not believe that this was going on. I had been in Iraq for a year and a half, and I didn't even. I had no idea the magnitude of what was happening. But I think it was just my newspaper assigned me to cover it for a year. I mean, that's a luxury that most media outlets don't have.
The next audience member had two questions. The first question for the author was what his impression was of the relationship between commercial and operational. His second question was about the mission of the private contractors. Vertical management exists within the conventional military, traditionally. The mission statement, however, where does the mission come from? Is it the State Department exclusively? Is it completely outside the authority of the Pentagon? Is there a relationship between the State Department and the Pentagon with respect to setting the mission for these mercenary companies?
Yeah, what I would say is the relationship is really complicated because most of the people who are doing these jobs come out of the military. So the people on the ground kind of look at them with a mixture of, resentment, curiosity, and awe. Resentment about the money because, here's a guy who's making multiple times more than I'm making for, doing the exact same work, and yet, how can I get that job? And the real problem is exactly what you're referring to. The problem with Blackwater was it was a State Department company, and so every time something would happen, if you read the book, you'll see that there were not an insignificant number of people who were pointing out that Blackwater was a huge problem directly to the United States military. And the military's response was, Blackwater is a State Department company. We don't really have any control over what they do. And it was a real source of frustration for Petraeus because when he came in at the beginning of 2007, he recognized immediately that there was this huge third force that was operating on the battlefield. And so he started sending out orders, trying to deal with weapons issues and rules for the use of force. And they tried to rein in companies. There were lots of companies, dozens of companies that were operating under DoD contracts. You got to keep reminding. I always try to explain this, but I always somehow there's some disconnect. I don't know why, but you have to keep in mind it's all about the contract. It's the contract that's the whole thing. So if I have a contract and I'm operating, under a subcontract of a subcontract of a subcontract. Like that incident where that guy shot into the windshield, that company was operating under like the 4th level of contract. So it never got anywhere near the military. The military just sort of, when it finally came to the attention of one guy in the green zone, his response was, not my job. So.
The next question for the audience was, what was Colin Powell's response to all of this? Or the Attorney General? Or the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Yeah, when I went to the State Department and asked them about Blackwater as a reporter, and I did it a lot. I sent email after email, made phone call after phone call. I mean, I can't describe how surreal it was, because for one, there really wasn't anybody else out there who was writing about this stuff, and except for me. And when I talked to the state, when I would go to the State Department, I would say, "Well, do you realize what is happening?" They would look at me, like, in the words of one of my friends, like I'd use their toothbrush. It was like, they were just like, what? It was like they looked at me like it was the stupidest question they had ever heard. And I never ever got any real reaction at all from state. And then, of course, it all blew up after Nusser Square, and then everybody acted like, oh, they had known it all along. It was weird. It was very weird.
The next question was whether the author had traced any of the connections to Blackwater replacing the National Guard in places like New Orleans after Katrina.
No, I didn't really get into that. I mean, Jeremy Scahill in his book, did an excellent job of charting Blackwater's rise and their involvement in Katrina. I mean, I was mostly focused on who these people were, why they were doing it, and what kind of jobs they were doing and how they were being regulated.
Where they came from, because they weren't around in World War II.
Right.
Korea.
The companies were like, I mean, it's really an interesting lesson in sort of basic economics. I mean, there was just like, the military had been privatizing for some time, obviously, but nothing on this scale. And really, it just went back to the fact that there just weren't enough troops. So everybody needed security. I mean, the Washington Post, we hired a whole security team to protect us when we moved around. And the International Republican Institute, chaired by John McCain, that promotes democracy, they had mercenaries. The National Democratic Institute, which is chaired by Madeleine Albright, they had mercenaries. I mean, everybody had them. So, yeah, it was just basic. People were in it for the money.
The next audience member asked the author to talk about the operatives who were protecting Paul Bremer. Were these a different class of operative, a different class of mercenary private contractor employee?
Well, it's a very interesting, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a really interesting question. Blackwater will tell you we're the elite of the elite. That the guys who were protecting Bremer and protecting the U.S. diplomats, they were like they were all spec ops, and they were or supposedly spec ops, but when you look at I don't know if everybody noticed, but one of the things that the defense lawyers for the guys who have been indicted in the Nusser Square case, they released their bios, their military bios, right? And one of the, it was basically a way to sort of buttress their case. They were kind of saying the audacity of the Justice Department to go after these military veterans, most of whom served in Iraq. But when you looked at those bios, those guys were not any more experienced than the guys who were working for Crescent.
This member of the audience followed up, referring to the photograph on the cover of the book, a photo of a private mercenary convoy, and asked the author to describe a case where Blackwater was protecting somebody in Iraq.
Well, the most famous story is in Najaf, where they were cornered, and I mean this is before I was even in Iraq, but they were cornered on the top of a building, and they were involved in the extrication of not only themselves but people who worked for the State Department in Najaf, and then they flew in additional ammunition. I mean, as I said, most of the people who were doing these jobs, I do believe were highly professional. But I think what happened with Blackwater is just the State Department allowed the company to get out of control, and without any rules, they just they were quicker and quicker on the trigger, and they felt like they were completely invulnerable.
The next question was about how the author saw these companies evolving in the future. Would we see them in more and more countries around the world? Will they be taking on more and more of a role, displacing the conventional military? And where are the laws or judicial processes that could protect people who come into contact with these mercenary companies?
Well, it's going to be interesting. It's a really good question, and I guess what I'd say, I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, I was noticing today that in Afghanistan, they're already contracting out for bases. There's new private security stuff. It's contracts that are even now being solicited, and I think there's going to be more of that. I mean, the genie's out of the bottle, and I think there's going to be a lot of money to be made in this business. I think the lessons of Iraq are such that the military is going to, if they start to privatize on this scale again, they're going to have to erect some sort of system to deal with it. But it's going to be easier said than done.
The next question for the author asked for his take on the lack of political opposition to the growing use and reliance on these mercenary companies. Referring back to the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, this member of the audience observed that the Kerry Commission produced a comprehensive report on the use of private contractors in the covert operations that were part of the U.S. wars in Central America. And yet Kerry did not discuss that report when he ran for president in 2004. It was as if Kerry was embarrassed to have been a part of the exposure of these illegal operations. It seems that nobody in a position of power and influence has confronted this issue.
No one noticed, really. I mean, it's not just the opposition. I just don't think anybody really noticed how huge this thing had gotten. What's that?
One member of the audience asked how members of Congress wouldn't have seen this in the budgets that they voted on to fund the wars.
Because a lot of it isn't in the budgets. I know that. Yeah. I mean, it was so... I can't even describe to you how ad hoc this whole thing was. I mean, thousands and thousands of contracts.
Another member of the audience disagreed, saying that a lot of the senators and representatives knew what was going on, but shut down any opposition.
I agree with you that after the fact, after they had privatized this world, and after these tens of thousands of people were in Iraq and operating, and and doing everything that they were doing, then people began to take notice. I totally agree with you.
The next member of the audience to speak observed that the use of mercenary companies was an alternative to reinstituting a military draft.
Exactly. I mean, alternative to, well, two things: a draft, for one, which is never going to happen, and and the addition of more troops. I mean, the Congressional Budget Office recently did a study about the number of contractors in Iraq, and they estimated that to replace these people would have required 9 additional brigades. So that's what it would have taken. But there was no. I mean, I think it's so cynical, because there was no political support. There was no support in the country to add that number of troops. So they just rented out a private army. That's basically what they did.
The next member of the audience observed that it is often forgotten that at the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, the majority of the American people supported the war. And, this audience member argued, the majority of the American people, in the beginning, probably supported the invasion of Iraq. Ultimately, the American people are to blame. Ultimately, we have to have a dialogue about the return to the draft, or some kind of system that replaces the current all-volunteer system, which obviously is not working if it can't provide enough soldiers for this war. Of course, we also have to ask how much of this kind of stuff the United States ought to be doing around the world, this kind of empire building, and all the other projects the U.S. has been undertaking over the past 12 years.
Well, what I would say is that I agree with you that to me this has been a war without almost, except for the people who are directly involved and their families, this has been a war without really any national sacrifice. And the use of private security contractors to do these jobs allows the government to do that.
To hide it.
Yeah, to hide. I mean, when you don't count them, then I think you.
This member of the audience said that he did not serve in Vietnam, although he was in the military during that time. He said that his brother, who was a company commander in Vietnam, pointed out that of the 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, only around 75,000 were combat troops. The other 425,000 troops were in bases that were typically a long way from the fighting. That changed when they were hit by the Tet Offensive, which brought the war to regions of the country that had seen virtually no combat.
Well, I always thought that was even scarier, because you had exactly what you're saying was true in Iraq.
Yeah.
Because you might have 160,000 troops on the ground, but only a fraction of that are actually out prosecuting the war and doing outside the wire, as it's called. But with the private security forces, a much higher ratio of those people are outside. And some people would make the case to me that there might be as many as 1-to-1 of troops who are actually out fighting the war as there are private security contractors, which is even scarier.
Again, this member of the audience followed up, asking what was the ratio of troops stationed in Iraq to the troops actually engaged in combat missions.
We'll never really know, because nobody ever knew exactly how many they were, but it was, huge numbers.
The next audience member observed that this is not the first time that mercenaries have been used, recalling from history books the accounts of the Hessians in New Jersey, when both the French and the British armies were overextended, and the French Foreign Legion was used in Southeast Asia. Mercenaries have been used whenever there's been a shortage of bodies and there's been money to pay people to fight.
Yeah, but there's never been anything even remotely close to this scale of use. I agree with you. It's not a new. The use of mercenaries is not a new phenomenon, but the use of this number of people, and and the government, even the military, has never authorized the use of civilians in combat the way they have in this war. Why don't we do one more question?
The next member of the audience observed that during the Vietnam War, there were American soldiers who were quite dangerous, who were genuinely crazy. They were trigger-happy, they were abusing alcohol and drugs, there was sexual violence against Vietnamese women, there were a lot of crazy soldiers doing a lot of crazy things. Is it the same in Iraq today?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like anywhere. I mean, one of the main differences between Vietnam and Iraq is that, in Iraq, the military strictly prohibited the use of alcohol anywhere on bases. That's not to say that it wasn't there, because obviously it was, but not nearly on the scale that you saw apparently in Vietnam. But the interesting thing is that the private security guys, the mercenaries, they didn't have to adhere to those rules. So they would have their own bars, these guys in the green zone, and drinking was a huge issue with the private security contractors.
What do they do for women?
Well, that was a whole sort of different story. I mean, on bases outside of the green zone, I mean, it's not really an issue. It's not like you could, like in Vietnam, where people would just go to Saigon and there wasn't any of that going on. So let me take one more.
The next question was about the numbers of American civilians in Iraq. Did the author say that there were 150,000 American civilians working there?
190,000. Not Americans. Not Americans. 190,000 contractors. Well, no one really knows. The Pentagon's own estimate is 25,000. That's the minimum estimate, and that's a huge number. I mean, that's more than a division. That's more than an additional division. Some people believe it's closer to 50. I think it's probably, who knows? But I think it's probably between 30 and 50. I mean, I'd been in Iraq for a year, and I'd discover a new company like every week. They were just, and some of them would come and go. There would be they'd exist on one contract, then they'd lose their contract, gone, no company.
The next question was about the author's work as a journalist. It seems that the language you use in your news reports is regulated. This audience member thought it was better to say that it was censored. For example, you're not allowed to use the word mercenary.
Well, it's my book, so I can call it whatever I want. I can call it whatever I want. I mean, when I work for the Washington Post, I adhere to the style of the newspaper. So.
The words stylings that you can't use. I mean, that would be pertinent that we'd like to know about.
It's a good question. I wouldn't call it censorship. I make a point in the book that my biggest frustration was not what I couldn't write, because I could write anything. No. I'm talking about in the newspaper now. In the book, the book is a totally different thing. But in the newspaper, my biggest frustration was, as a journalist, that Iraq was an unbelievably violent place, unbelievably violent, indescribably violent, and the Bush administration was in this, concerted effort to make sure that all traces of that violence were completely wiped away. No coffins, no blood, nothing, so that nobody could have. Yeah, it was completely sanitized. And so I would send in these stories that, I felt characterized the violence at the level that it was being, that it was occurring. And sometimes that violence, sometimes the editors would take when it became especially graphic, sometimes they would take it out of the stories. And that was frustrating. But I think that was my own feeling is that was a matter of decorum. My feeling was that it was wrong, because people should know what the war looks like. The whole private security mercenary thing was a decision that was made within the newspaper that the term mercenary was. I mean, I think, because I never actually heard it articulated, but my sense was that it was a sense pejorative. To me, it was like, you should call it what it is. I mean, people are fighting the war for money. I mean, for whatever else is going on, that's the basic reason why they're there. So, well, thanks everybody for coming. This is really enjoyable. Thank you.
You've been listening to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Steve Fainaru talking about his latest book, Big Boy Rules: America's Mercenaries Fighting in Iraq. Steve Fainaru is a correspondent for the Washington Post. He received the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on security contractors working in Iraq. Steve Fainaru spoke at Powell's City of Books in Portland, Oregon on December 8, 2008. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to resources for additional information about the topics discussed by Steve Fainaru, as well as many other free, on-demand streaming video and audio programs featuring speakers such as Jeremy Scahill, author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, Phyllis Bennis, Chris Hedges, Susan Faludi, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.